Welcome to this session on co-creation and stakeholder engagement for impact in agile sprints. My name is Barbrook-Johnson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Agile Initiative. I'm also a researcher over in the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford and a lecturer in the School of Geography and Environment. I'm really from a social science and kind of economics background. I'm going to be starting off the session today, and then we're going to be moving over to a section from Carlo. So Carlo Palazzi is a researcher who's worked directly on one of the sprints within Agile, and he's a PhD student in the Department for Engineering at Oxford. This session is the third in a suite or a set or an ensemble or an assemblage, whatever you want to call it, of workshops on how we've been approaching things in Agile. You know, we're 2.5 years in. We have learned a few lessons. We've had a few successes, a few failures. And so we're really in these sessions been trying to dive into how we approach different things within a sprint and how we do it. So in theory, we're trying to be quite specific and detailed here. I think with a topic like co-creation and engagement, it's very easy to be hand wavy and kind of a bit vague and waffly. I'm definitely guilty of that sometimes, but we'll try and move past that and get into the details of how we do things. The rough plan is I'll do an intro now. I'll speak for about 15-20 minutes, give you a sense of what we mean by co-creation and engagement, how we've been approaching that in Agile. I'll hint at a little bit of the kind of wider theory and literatures on co-creation and co-production. Then we'll have we can pause there if there are questions. Then we'll move into the second part that Carlo will lead, looking really at this case study that he was closely involved with, working on green ammonia with Department for Transport. Okay, so let's dive in. So I think hopefully not too controversial to say these topics, co-creation and engagement, are much abused terms and kind of thrown around quite liberally. And so there's a lot of different terms and a lot of different meanings attached to them, and that might be something we dig into. I don't want to dwell on that too much, but I think we do need to recognize that. There's also, I think, a very strong pressure from our funders, the big funders that many researchers are used to working with, let alone when we start talking about government funders or philanthropic funders. But, you know, big research funders put quite a strong pressure on us to do impactful work and show the policy relevance of our work. And I think it's quite clear now, the last kind of 10, 15 years, maybe going back even longer, that co-creation or co-production or co-design have become the kind of some of the dominant ways to do that, to make our work have more impact and have more policy relevance. And you can kind of see on the right-hand side here a kind of diagram which is taken from some of the literature on co-production, some of these terms might be different. So I think when I'm talking about co-creation and co-production, and I will use those interchangeably, even though some people prefer not to, it's where we're really saying the user participation is high, as well as the motivation for the research coming from problems rather than the existing knowledge. And you can see there how that might be different to thinking about applied research, or, you know, stuff, you know, where we could be guilty of being in our own ivory tower, where we're just doing things for the sake of knowledge with very little user participation. Like I said already, I do think a lot of researchers are guilty of throwing these terms around and paying lip service to them and sort of saying we're going to do co-creation or we're going to do co-production and not really meaning it, or making space for it. Even if they mean it and their intentions are good, they then don't necessarily make the space for it and acknowledge it and make sure their team have the skills for it. And I also think funders are guilty of that as well. It's easy for funders to just throw in everything must be co-created without actually helping researchers to do that. So I think a lot of lip service is paid to these terms. And yeah, hopefully that's not too controversial or rude to say. I've heard that sentiment repeated a lot. In Agile, I hope, I definitely personally believe that we really mean it when we say these words. We really envisage quite a deep approach to co-creation and co-production, and that when we feel that there's a weakness around co-creation, and co-production and engagement with different groups of stakeholders, that becomes something we really worry a lot about and start to bug people about and ask questions about, and even maybe, and I've seen this firsthand, and even don't fund things. You know, part of Agile's role is to fund projects, fund these sprints, and if there's a big gap on co-creation, but the science itself is looking solid, that's still enough to mean that we don't move forward for things. So I hope we really mean it, and we're not so guilty of paying lip service, although I think it's easy for everyone to fall into that. What I've kind of already started to hint at this. What do we really mean by these two terms? I think just to give a kind of stake in the ground beginning kind of definition, although these are not perfect, this is more me kind of shooting from my hip. By co-creation, I'm really talking about developing the purpose, the questions, the resources, the broad approach and framings, the methods and the outputs with stakeholders. And hopefully you already get a sense that's basically everything, right? It's kind of developing everything about the research, including its fundamental aims and kind of conception, doing that with stakeholders and seeing stakeholders as collaborators or even co-owners of that research. It's something we do before, throughout, and probably even after a particular project or piece of funding. And in this mode, we kind of don't think of stakeholders or research users as recipients or clients in some sense. They're much more of a partnership, a partner, something to people we collaborate with. They're not, and they're also not a resource. They're not something where we just kind of mine them for questions or mine them for input in some way. And engagement, I think, is a kind of a slightly broader term, but I again would take it to have similar connotations, that we're talking to stakeholders throughout the research and before and after. We're working with them on the research. And I think just to sort of prod a bit deeper into that, I think it's also important to say, you know, engagement is not just occasionally doing very set piece type of things. It's not occasionally just doing a policy brief or occasionally writing a more public facing piece or occasionally having a big event where we invite stakeholders. It's that more consistent collaboration and engagement with stakeholders through time. So it's not just these one-off set pieces. I'm by no means an absolute expert on co-creation and engagement. There are whole literatures of work on these topics. There is, if you really want to go deeper into those kind of literatures and really get into the nuance of how people have approached these topics, we have, I'm just one member of a larger team who've been working on what we're calling a discussion document, almost like a kind of provocation document to kind of reviews the literature and then tries to say, well, here's all the things we should be thinking about when we're working in that kind of agile type way. So that document is being launched a webinar on the 3rd of June. We've got a super catchy title. You can see there in the link, should universities shift from being evidence producers to co-producers? If you want to go deeper into those literatures and get a sense of those discussions, please do sign up for the webinar in a few weeks. Just to give you a hint of some of the stuff that's in there and some of the depth and the detail that's underneath these literatures. This is one table I wanted to show. I just have two of these tables. This one is about understanding the different ways that disciplines have thought about co-production. So co-production is the word used here by Bandola, Gill and colleagues. But I take it co-creation to be very, very similar. So what I think is interesting here is that we already see there's different kind of types or different understandings, and they are attached maybe to different disciplines. So in the more potentially, again, these are broad brush statements, but in the kind of more science-based disciplines, things like work on climate change, we might see co-production about bridging or supplying evidence into policy making. And it's about kind of closing this gap between evidence and policy. Whereas in more interdisciplinary disciplines, maybe like environmental management, where we're working more at local scales, thinking about management of particular environmental areas or resources, there it becomes more about widening participation and bringing in different forms of knowledge. Then we move through to disciplines like the broader kind of sustainability science, a discipline that's kind of emerged in the last 20 years or so, where there's a much more emphasis on kind of value pluralism and knowledge pluralism, and this idea that there are lots of different types of knowledge and values, and we need co-production and co-creation to create the collaboration for those to come together. In science and technology studies, as you might expect from that field it's a bit more meta, thinking about, there's a lot of literature there thinking about how co-production and co-creation are being used. And then lastly, through to field, I think this is where I'd probably place myself if I had to, the fields around kind of policy analysis and public administration, where there's a slightly more kind of technocratic idea about we need to bring different disciplines together. We need to bring policymakers and evidence producers together to enhance the effectiveness of research and kind of close the policy gaps. It almost brings us a little bit round full circle to the similar to the top row. But there's a whole variety in there. There's also, I think, a variety in the what we might call the modes of co-production, or the kind of purpose or the aims of co-production. This comes from a paper from, I think it was Nature Sustainability, from Chambers and colleagues, which kind of tries to define 6 approaches to co-production, or 6 modes. I think of them as a kind of, what's the aim or the purpose of what we're trying to do. So again, we start with a kind of slightly more technical understanding, maybe slightly more traditional understanding, where the idea is that we are trying to look for solutions. We are producing scientific knowledge that will feed into that kind of existing evidence policy landscape that we're in. Or we might shift into slightly different modes, where we might think about empowering voices, where we might be thinking about, again, this idea of pluralism and different types of knowledge and bringing those into research. We might be thinking about brokering power and turning the role of research into producing kind of policy action and evidence that is directly useful for policy action, rather than just producing evidence or knowledge in a more generic sense. We might be talking about reframing power, where we are trying to think about shifting power down to more local levels. We might be navigating differences and almost research becoming a kind of, I think I often see this a lot in research projects, where researchers play an interesting role. They can broker relationships between different stakeholders, and they're kind of seen somehow as reasonably neutral, and can play that kind of role. Or we can even think about co-production as kind of completely reframing how we think about agency in a system, and who has the right to act and how we should act in a system. And we can think about co-production as kind of being a slightly different way of governing or acting within a system. So there's a whole variety there of modes, of ways that co-production might be deployed. And do encourage you to have that paper. I think is pretty short and digestible. So I would encourage you to have a look at those. So that's the kind of slightly dry definitions and some of this kind of theory or literature on co-production and co-creation. How do we actually do things in Agile? So I just want to talk briefly about this and then give a sense of what we think co-production was, what we think co-creation really looks like in practice. So first thing to note is that the sprints are developing and changing. So our first cohort of sprints, you may have read about on the website, are different to the ones that are coming through now, or the later ones, and the ones that will be emerging in the coming months and years. We are constantly kind of developing the Agile model, experimenting. One of our values is experimenting, and we are experimenting with the way we work. So there is change here, but at the moment, this is the rough kind of process. Whether we have a sprint funded, kind of the idea for a sprint come from a research team, or come from Agile's kind of more centrally going out and looking for topics, there is this kind of first stage where we are trying to decide the topic, the questions, the broad approach that might be used. And I think that really happens either with the research team developing that with the stakeholders, or with us as a kind of central Agile team developing that and putting those into our calls. Those of you that saw our call that came out in February will have seen that we had topics that were kind of roughly outlined in this way, and that had come from a kind of initial stage of co-creation with stakeholders. Then there's this kind of expression of interest stage, which is the first point at which researchers kind of approach us through one of our calls and say, we would like to work on this topic. That's quite light touch in the sense that it's short. There's a short set of documents, but probably there are some interesting conversations and bits of co-creation that need to happen there. Of those expressions of interest, these kind of mini proposals, some of those are then taken forward, and then there's a much deeper, much richer co-creation stage before the sprint has started, but a much richer stage where researchers and stakeholders will be talking in quite a lot of detail together, in a sense, kind of writing a fuller proposal together, making sure that everything about that sprint speaks to our stakeholders kind of needs. And then that's all before it's even started. Then of course, throughout the sprint, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening. And even I think post-sprint things will happen. I think we should acknowledge that it doesn't just stop dead at the end of the sprint. There's also, I think, a wider set of activities that Agile as a program are trying to conduct, where we're speaking to policy partners. And when I say policy partners, I mean public sector, but also private sector NGOs. We're speaking to those types of research users about what's useful for them and trying to learn with them. And so even that I would include as this kind of slightly meta, longer term co-creation. But I think in the Agile sprint model, the really key stages are that number 1 and number 3 there. These kind of early ideas, and then the ideas that we take forward, this kind of deep effort to develop a full proposal before a sprint even starts. And an initial topic might come up, and then it might change hugely by the time it gets to that full proposal. So things can shift a lot at that stage, and that's, I think, largely driven by the co-creation we're trying to do. Okay, so what does it look like in practice? This is kind of a slightly more kind of speculative, my reflections on what I think good co-creation, good engagement looks like. I think the holy grail we're kind of aiming for is to think about stakeholders as long-term collaborators, almost like there are, our work friends. There are people who have similar aims. They're pushing for the same causes. We might have shared interests. We are in regular informal contact with these people. These are not people that we just occasionally email and are slightly scared of or very nervous about interacting with because it's a one-shot kind of, if we don't have a good chat this time, it's ruined. These are longer term, more informal, more organic relationships. I think that's what we should be aiming for. And it's really the relationships that are important rather than individual projects, I think, over the long term. That's difficult. That takes time. Some relationships will drop away. It shouldn't be that every stakeholder you ever speak to, you then form this kind of deep relationship with. And equally, I think we should try and avoid relying on individuals. It's kind of natural we might gravitate towards individuals that we build a bit of rapport with, but I think we should try and avoid reliance on individual people or individual organizations. So it should be, if one stakeholder suddenly says, I can't act in this because I'm coming under pressure from somewhere else, that's not a kind of fatal issue for us. Or if one individual moves job role, which is very common in a lot of sectors, not least the public sector, if that happens, that's not kind of again another fatal flaw for us. And I've already said, I think we should avoid this kind of set piece, one-off type events mentality. At the beginning of, when we're starting off in co-creation, I think big key things that I've definitely been guilty of missing in the past, but I think we always need to do, we need to really agree and make sure we're on the same page with our stakeholders, what the working style, what the mode of working will be. We need to have agreement on the type of commitments both sides are making, and not about money or being precise about things, but I think having a rough sense of time commitments if we're expecting people to co-create, co-produce outputs with us or attend, or co-host events, being really clear about that. And particularly on outputs, I think we need to be really clear about what the useful outputs are for people. I'm very suspicious when someone says, oh, my co-creation is that we're going to write a policy brief, and that's kind of all that there is. A policy brief on its own, I think, is unlikely to be sufficient. The output should be more informal and more ongoing through the project. The output should be those presentations you give a few months in or a few weeks into a project. The kind of constant communication, that's part of the output into people in the policy and business worlds, I think, just as much as kind of shiny reports at the end. Of course, all of this ends up happening in quite an informal way. I've very rarely seen proper contracts for these types of relationships. You might, if they're receiving funding, of course, you might do that, but otherwise it's rare. I've occasionally seen kind of memorandums of understanding, letters of support, but those can be quite vague. And lastly, something I've definitely been guilty of is you can kind of find, this kind of goes back to my point about not relying on individuals too much. You can kind of fall in love a bit with a particular policy partner and find a relationship that works, and then everything revolves around that, and almost I think there's a risk we can become almost co-opted, or kind of we lose our critical distance. I think we should be conscious of that. We should be constantly kind of scanning the stakeholder horizon, as it were. There's a huge long list of stakeholder mapping techniques out there. we should be using those to help us think about dimensions around power differences, voices that aren't often heard, decisions at different geographic scales, be using those kind of stakeholder mapping techniques to help us just keep a slightly more critical distance. Last slide from me, I think, and then I'll shut up and we can pause for questions. I think it's really important to acknowledge that all of this takes a lot of time, a lot of kind of skills that take time to build up, and a lot of effort. We need to make sure that we are clearly assigning roles as we understand who is responsible for what, and make time for this type of deep co-creation and engagement work. And almost, I mean, as academics, potentially most important, to really recognize contributions and slightly think about, does someone deserve the right to be an author on a paper because they were absolutely crucial to that co-creation process, even if they then weren't used later? Or how do we acknowledge that kind of effort? I think we need to be quite open-minded about how we do that. I think it's also important to know that there's people often say, "Oh, I don't know how to do this," or "I'm not experienced in co-creation or speaking to stakeholders." And I don't think there's any prep, and this is my personal opinion, I don't think there's a huge amount of prep you can do for that. You can't go on a course from it. You can't attend a webinar that then just fixes it all for you. You just have to dive in because there's a huge amount of tacit knowledge. Lastly, two things I'll just say on timing. I think one thing that comes up again and again is when you are in a deep kind of co-creation relationship, sort of sudden opportunities can pop up and stakeholders can say, "Oh, can we have this thing by next week, or this thing by next month would be useful. There's this meeting or this report that's happening, this process that we'd love you to feed into." And you have to suddenly mobilize to do that. And I think there's a big decision there about trying to how you manage that and making sure that there's enough flex in your project plans that you can respond to opportunities, and almost before the opportunity comes up, having a kind of position. What type of things are we willing to change for, and what type of things will we say, no, that's not quite right, that's a distraction? Because there is a risk that you just are constantly kind of firefighting and taking on requests, and you lose, it kind of actually gets in the way of the fundamental research you're trying to do. And lastly, on timing, I think I've already said a bit about making time within the project, but I think also we need to be really cognizant of the larger kind of timescales that our stakeholders are working on. So just to give some public policy examples, particularly this year, this is going to be very relevant. PERDA is going to be coming up. You're going to have civil servants unable to publicly speak on topics, around the election. Maybe not long after that, there's going to be spending review if there's a new government, etc. I think there will be a spending review due soon in any case. And in these kind of periods, in the public sector, you just can't expect civil servants to be as engaged. And so I think in that, and there will be equivalent types of things in the private and NGO world. So I think we need to be conscious of those two, these kind of real practical timing elements. Okay, I will pause there. Before I take any questions that are there, I just wanted to flag two resources that I think are really excellent and I found really useful. One is the Fast Track Impact website, which is run by Mark Reed. There's a whole bunch of resources on there that I'd recommend having a look at. And then slightly closer to home, there's the Open Oxford Policy Engagement Network, which again, the website there has a whole bunch of really useful resources. So do check those out. And of course, get in touch with me, with Carlo, with others, if you're just like not sure where to start. I'm going to pass over to Carlo now, and I think we should keep cracking on. So yeah, Carlo, over to you. I'll keep controlling the slides. Just tell me when to click on.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, if you could skip ahead a couple to the page with the introduction of the team. My name's Carlo. I am currently a DPhil in engineering science, but I joined the green ammonia shipping sprint a year and a half ago now as policy liaison officer as well as research assistant. And I think the first thing is really to highlight that role existing in the sprint is something that's really useful. And I'll come to that in a second. But before that, I need to tell you a tiny bit about the sprint to give you an idea about what we were doing, because the aim of this session is to give you a concrete example of all the very good general lessons that Pete's just given. How did they apply to our sprint, and how you might be able to take that as an example for your own research programs? So our sprint was looking at green ammonia for shipping. And it brought in researchers from engineering, from geography, and from policy engagement. And Pete, next slide, please. Just a tiny bit about why green ammonia is something that needs to be looked at for shipping. The shipping sector is responsible for almost 3% of global emissions. There's a target to decarbonize the sector by 2050, but it's hard to abate. So we need to look at alternative green fuels. One of those green fuels we can look at that looks to be the most promising for long distance transport is ammonia. And the stakeholders that we targeted for this, there was somebody that immediately came to mind when the sprint was being planned, was the UK Shipping Office for Reducing Emissions, who are a team within the Department for Transport. Next slide, please, Pete. So what's the basis of the research? Just really briefly, we developed a model to optimize production and delivery of green ammonia to ports globally. And there are lots of ways we thought this could be used by policymakers, but although some of the team that we had on board that we co-created this sprint with had a policy background, the close contact and the current situation of thinking inside DFT was something that we needed to query to move forward with the application and further development of this model. So just this map really briefly, green spots are where ammonia is being produced and then exported to be delivered to other ports that are the red ports, which are the demand ports that need fuel. So basically we mapped the fuel demand today to what it could be in 2050 if long distance shipping was using ammonia, and we optimized the production of it around the world using solar and wind to fuel Haber-Bosch process to produce ammonia. So it's a tiny, tiny bit of insight that you need to have to understand the rest of the session, but the focus will now shift more onto how we went about co-creating before the sprint, during the sprint, and after the sprint. Next slide, please, Pete. So first off, find. You need to find the people that you want to co-create with, and it's a very, all of the things that I'm going to talk about are very, very practical things. There's frameworks behind it, but the actual steps you need to do is basically just looking people up on LinkedIn, looking people up on their department pages, and involve policy academics. If we hadn't had Anupama Sen on our team, we would have spent weeks longer trying to find the right people to talk to, but policy academics generally will know some key people that you need to talk to and key things to read. There will be some published documents on your research area that maybe you won't have looked at before. None of us in engineering science had really looked at current policy documents, and it was only in beginning this research that we were recommended by Anupama to look at the Clean Maritime Plan. There will be documents of a similar kind in your research areas. Next step, Pete, please. After finding the people you need to speak to, you need to engage with them. So the ways to do that are by showcasing what your team could do and why the department or other stakeholders might be interested in working with you. So having some past results that might be relevant to the future program, even if it's a slightly different topic, just giving an idea of what your team could be capable of if this sprint is funded, or at the start of the sprint, if the sprint engages deeper with the stakeholder, then that's a good basis for your co-creation project. So before the sprint, and this answers, I think, some of the questions that were coming up during the kind of question interval, the level of detail was nowhere near what was eventually output. You know, there was a plan to engage. We'd contacted the Department for Transport, had some agreements in place that there would be some form of engagement, that there would be a policy liaison officer, so somebody who would engage regularly with the department to steer the research as the sprint progressed, but by no means was it all finalized at the beginning. DFT did not have the capacity to come back to us in the EOI period, the expression of interest period, because it's a very brief window. So a commitment to work together is basically what we had, but detailed in the degree to which that would happen, as in policy liaison officer, somebody who would reach out on a bi-weekly basis, and then on top of that, policy brief, and outlined that we were going to host 3 key workshops during the year to bring in stakeholders. So that's the kind of level we proposed at, without it being fully detailed out. The engagement really grew after the first 3 months of the sprint, because although there was prior planning, until we developed the basic tools, it seemed like DFT would find it difficult to engage with us, and other stakeholders difficult to engage with us, because our capacity wasn't fully clear yet. So we invited representatives from industry, academia, and government to a major workshop, hybrid, and we had a lot of attendees in person, but organized it around the dates that stakeholders from UK Shore could make, which was tricky, but definitely worth putting the time into organizing it around them, making them feel valued. Next slide, please, Pete. Then co-creation proper, in my mind, kicks off in the real detailed, what are the exact cases that you would like to run, and what is the exact information that all of the people that in your stakeholder team might be of interest, and start co-creation workshops. Then deliverables can be agreed after all of this information gathering has happened. Next slide, please, Pete. So those 3 steps, and the ambition then is we have this engaged group of stakeholders all rowing together. It's going to be plain sailing all the way to the end. That's the ambition. The risk is this. Thank you, Pete. You've brought in a whole load of people. They all have different priorities, different ideas. That's why the policy liaison role, I think, is really vital, because it gives somebody, and let me just clarify, I wasn't full-time policy liaison officer. I was a research assistant. I did a lot of the modeling work and ran scenarios for the team. I'd say maybe 20% of my time was dedicated to policy liaison. But the fact that title existed was really key, because I felt justified in spending time doing that kind of prioritization and engagement work that was really vital in leading the sprint. So how do we avoid this risk of having loads of people not pulling together and actually ending up somewhat stranded with a bloated research ambition? Next slide, please, Pete. The devil's in the details. It's these info gathering meetings and co-creation workshops. Next slide, please, Pete. That are really the tricky bit in my mind, or they were in my mind, and we definitely didn't do them perfectly, but I'm hoping to share with you the insights that we got from that and make you comfortable with being able to host your own, and with the pitfalls that there might be. So next slide, please, Pete. There are a lot of pieces of information on this slide, and this is where the exercise that I'd planned is going to start. I'm going to try and run it very quickly, but I'll try and get at least a little bit of interaction. On here, there's a brief description of our research on the left. So we had a forecast fuel demand at 1,300 ports and a model to optimize green ammonia delivery. There's some things we could do easily, like changing costs of production at certain sites to model market distortions. And we were working at the time on import diversification constraints, because we had some strange scenarios where, some countries were getting all of their green ammonia from a single country, and that might be seemed a bit risky. So we presented this model at a workshop that we hosted with DFT. In my policy liaison role, I reached out to the lead contact that we'd been given there, had fortnightly check-ins with them, even if we didn't have anything major to update on. But having those relationships, going into DFT a few times and meeting people in person, really helped turn those stakeholders more into colleagues, and then gave us the confidence to host these workshops with people from their department that we hadn't worked with closely, but that they thought might have something to contribute. So we've got this model. We asked them, we've agreed that we're going to provide some insights on this topic that you've said is important to you, but some insights is a very vague thing. So during this meeting, and in the weeks before and after, I've kind of collated 16, 17 things they asked for. We presented this on green ammonia, and they said, what about methanol and methane? What about hydrogen batteries? What about at-sea bunkering vessels? Now the exercise. Imagine that you're part of this sprint. Which of these points looks doable given this simple model? And I know that we don't have the details, you don't have the details of the model, but just I want you to be in the mindset of being in this sprint and having to make some decisions about prioritizing, having to compromise on some points. So here we've got these ones on the right. Western Sahara appears as one of the major exporters of green ammonia. That's an unstable region at the moment. Is that really likely? So again, people questioning our model and what we've done. What level of subsidies would the UK have to provide us to compete as an exporter? Just the top three. The UK does not appear to be an exporter in the model, yet a lot of people are expecting the UK to export wind energy, basically, because we've got great wind potential. Those top three, do you reckon, can you tell me something they have in common? Do you reckon that's doable in the sprint with our model?
For the top two, these are really interesting. They feel like they're much more like contextual information. Definitely the one about the instability. And yeah, should the UK be they're kind of like they're asking you to just do things that the model wouldn't directly answer. So they feel like more contextual somehow, which feels challenging.
That is challenging, but actually we'd said on the left that one of the things we can easily look at is changing costs of production in certain areas. So we can look at maybe doing a very simplified analysis where we say, oh, what would it take for the UK to be an exporter? These are kind of market effects that we can model. And some of them, yeah, without the detail necessarily, would look simple, and others complicated. In your own research, you will know exactly which ones they are, but you might not even know during the meeting. So being able to respond by saying, this might be doable, but give us some time. This is unlikely to be doable, but we'd love to look at it in future. They're all techniques that you're going to have to use. Could you hop forward a couple, Pete? And I'm sorry, I'm also coming up close to time. So what did we do in the end? We had this meeting. We showed what we were capable of, and we agreed 3 deliverables that aligned with some of the proposals we had, the capability that we had, and the rest we sadly had to let go. So in the end, we looked at import origin diversification, and we ran models on a simple view of ports as fuel hubs. So what happens if the UK is importing ammonia both for shipping fuel and for fertilizer and for additional energy? And as well as 2 academic papers coming out from that, a policy brief document is nearly prepared. And all of this not resolved in a single meeting, but these kind of large central workshops on co-creation that we plan towards, and then we respond to afterwards, maintaining contact with our lead academic advisors in the department, is really what structured all of the research period. And that leads me to the summary slide, which is, I guess, Carlo's 3 C's, we could call them. Communication, you find your stakeholders, engage with them routinely. Routinely is the key word there. Policy liaison officer is a great title to give to one of your researchers because it really justifies the time spent on engaging with your stakeholders. Compromise, we had some examples of things we couldn't do in the period. Agile sprints are brief and people have a lot of questions. So compromise. And then commit. Agreeing the deliverables is really, really key. So once you've decided on a very lean set of things you can deliver, then you follow through, keep communicating. Those can change with discussions and prioritizations because the whole process is open with the stakeholders if you have this engagement role. But you have to deliver on what you promise, and that builds trust for future work and future engagement.